Now, January 29th, Compton, California. A man drives his truck into the parking lot of a burger stand called Tam's Burgers. There's an altercation, he reverses, he goes forward, 2 men go down. One of the men is a 55-year-old businessman named Terry Carter. He dies from his injuries within the hour. And Terry Carter wasn't just a random person in the parking lot. He was connected to the world the story comes from. Someone who had known the driver of that truck for years. The driver eventually flees the scene. Hours later, police have him in custody.
Breaking news out of LA, a music industry mogul under arrest after a deadly hit and run. Suge Knight, a hip-hop figure who's had run-ins with the law in the past.
That man was marrying Suge Knight. Now, if you know hip-hop history, you already know the name and the face. And if you don't, you're about to find out. Because for a long stretch of the 1990s, Suge Knight ran one of the most powerful and dangerous record labels the music industry had ever seen, Death Row Records. Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, Tupac Shakur, some of the most important names in rap history, all passed through that label during one of hip-hop's most iconic eras. And at the center of it all was Suge Knight, not just as a businessman, as a presence, as someone the entire music industry knew not to cross. He didn't build that reputation by accident. He built it deliberately, through fear, intimidation, and control. And for a while, it worked. It worked better than almost anyone could have predicted. But that's exactly what this video is about, because that same energy that made Suge Knight feel untouchable, that same operating system, eventually became the thing that trapped him. Before we get into any of what made Suge Knight who he became, we need to start at the beginning, because the beginning doesn't look anything like the ending. Marion Hugh Knight Jr. was born on April 19, 1965, in Compton, California. His father gave him the nickname Suge, short for Sugar Bear, because as a kid, he was apparently sweet-natured, gentle even. His mother Maxine once told a magazine, "My son is the type of person who still sends me roses all the time." And I want you to really peep the contrast, because that's not the Suge Knight that we knew. Growing up, Suge poured most of his energy into sports. He was a football track star at Linwood High School, not far from Compton, earning letters all 4 years. He was good enough to get a scholarship to El Camino College, and then good enough to transfer to the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And during his first year on defense, he won Rookie of the Year. His own coach described him as Super Bowl material, the kind of guy you love having on your side. So this wasn't a kid with no options or nothing like that. Suge had a real path, a very legitimate one. And Suge got as close as you can without fully making it. He went undrafted in the 1987 NFL draft, but he was still invited to Los Angeles Rams training camp. He got cut before the season, but then when NFL players went on strike in 1987, Suge came back as a replacement player and actually played 2 games for the Rams. 2 games, that's how close he got. But when it became clear the NFL wasn't going to be his long-term path, Suge decided to pivot. He started working as a bodyguard. One of his clients was Bobby Brown. He did concert promotion work, and little by little, he started making connections inside the music industry. And this is where the story starts to shift, because Suge had spent most of his life understanding size, pressure, presence, and physical dominance. On a football field, those things can make you valuable. But when that same energy enters the music business, it becomes something different. Because as much as people love to talk about the music industry has always been mostly business. Contracts, ownership, leverage, control. And Suge seemed to understand something early. In that world, power doesn't always go to the most talented person. Sometimes it goes to the person who can apply the most pressure. So when the NFL door closed, Suge didn't leave those instincts behind. He just found a different arena to use them in. And the music business, especially in the late 1980s and early 1990s, was about to find that out. So by the late 1980s, Suge Knight had his foot in the door of the music industry. Suge was just someone who knew how to navigate in different environments, and he knew how to adapt. And so eventually Suge started his own music publishing company. Small operation, but it put him in the right rooms. And it wasn't long before those rooms started producing results, not always through conventional means. Now the first story most people bring up is Vanilla Ice. Now I want to be a little careful here, because this story has been told 100 different ways, and some versions of it are more legend than fact. Let's just put it like that. So let me tell you what's actually confirmed. So Suge Knight had an associate named Mario Johnson, who had a writing credit connected to Vanilla Ice's hit, Ice Ice Baby. And Suge Knight believed royalties were owed, so he went to collect a check. Now what happened next, depending on who you ask, ranges from a firm conversation to something a lot more threatening. So the most famous version of that story is that Suge dangled Vanilla Ice over a hotel balcony until he agreed to sign over the royalties. Vanilla Ice himself has denied that specific detail. He said the balcony story, as it's been told, didn't happen that way. Honestly, sounds like something Suge would do, right? I kind of believe the balcony story, I'll be honest with you. What do you think? Now this is what Vanilla Ice has confirmed. Suge Knight and several armed men showed up in his hotel room. One of his bodyguards was slapped and disarmed. And after that meeting, however exactly it went, Vanilla Ice signed over the royalties. Honestly, it sounds like he was dangled over a balcony. Because why would he sign it over? I mean, he was afraid, obviously. I would be afraid too if Suge Knight pulled up on you, right? But what do you guys think? Do you think that he was dangled over a balcony? Or do you think that didn't happen? Vanilla Ice stated that Suge's message to him was essentially, "This is my city. You want to be here, you pay." So the balcony part has been disputed. I still kind of believe it. But the confrontation, the armed men, and the pressure that led to royalties being signed over confirmed by Vanilla Ice himself. Now around the same time, something else was happening that would end up being a lot more significant. Dr. Dre was signed to Ruthless Records, the label run by Eazy-E and his manager, Jerry Heller. Dr. Dre wanted out. The details of why is a whole nother story. But the short version is that the situation had become uncomfortable enough that Dre was looking for an exit, and so Suge Knight actually became that exit. According to Jerry Heller's own memoir, Suge Knight and a group of associates showed up to Ruthless Record offices with baseball bats and lead pipes and made it very clear that Dre's contract was going to be released. And according to Jerry Heller, he described it as a direct physical threat, not a negotiation. So this comes from Jerry Heller. It's his version of events from his book. However, Suge Knight has never publicly confirmed it in those exact terms, but it's been corroborated enough by journalists and industry observers over the years that it's treated as credible reporting, not as established legal fact, but as the most detailed account we have of how that situation actually went down. What isn't disputed though is that Dre left Ruthless and he went straight to Suge. In 1991, Death Row Records was founded, marrying Suge Knight, Dr. Dre, and the DOC. At its core, it was a rap label, but from the very beginning, the way it was built reflected exactly how Suge operated. Funding for the label reportedly came in part from a man named Michael Harris, known as Harry O, who was serving a prison sentence at the time. The connection between Harris and Death Row's early financing has been confirmed through court-related reporting and legal proceedings. Harris himself later sued over royalties. However, that's a whole nother story. So at this point in the story, I just want you to take away this. Suge Knight entered the music industry with no artists initially, right? No record, no studio. What he had was a reputation, a physical presence, and the willingness to apply pressure in situations where most people would have sent a lawyer. He got royalties from Vanilla Ice. He got Dr. Dre out of a contract at Ruthless. He got funding. He got distribution. He got a label. None of that happened through conventional business channels. It happened because the people on the other side of those situations made a calculation that whatever Suge was asking for was worth less than whatever would happen if they said no. That's not luck, that's a strategy, a specific, deliberate, dangerous strategy. And in 1991, with Death Row Records officially open for business, that strategy was about to scale up in ways nobody could have predicted. And here's where the story shifts, because everything we just talked about, the publishing company, the confrontations, the way Suge moved to the music industry, that was the setup, and what came next was the payoff. For a stretch of time in the 1990s, Death Row Records was generally one of the most powerful forces in American music, not just in hip-hop, in music period. It started with Dr. Dre. In 1992, after Dr. Dre released The Chronic through Death Row, the reception to that album changed the direction of West Coast hip-hop, the production style, the sound, all of it. The album eventually went triple platinum, and it introduced the world to a young rapper named Snoop Dogg. A year later, Snoop dropped Doggy Style, and those were the two biggest rap records the genre had seen at that point. So Death Row wasn't just in the conversation. It was the conversation. And Suge Knight was at the center of all of it. Not as an artist, not as a producer, but the person who controlled the environment, who set the tone, who made sure everyone around him understood exactly how things worked. Death Row was reportedly generating around $100 million a year in revenue. That's an estimated figure. So it was a serious commercial operation at the top of the industry. And then there was these Source Awards, one of the most talked about moments in hip-hop award show history. Suge Knight gets on stage and says, and I'm paraphrasing, that any artist who doesn't want their executive producer all over their videos, all over their records dancing, should come to Death Row. Everybody in that room knew exactly what he was saying and who he was talking about. It wasn't just beef, it was a public declaration of dominance. And Suge was telling the whole industry that he was on smoke. And at that point in 1995, he had the receipts to back it up. That same year, Tupac Shakur was in prison, serving time on a sexual assault conviction. He was one of the most recognizable names in rap at that point, and he was sitting inside a cell. Suge Knight went to give him an offer. Death Row would post the $1.4 million needed to get him out on bail in exchange for Tupac signing with the label. Tupac took the deal. After the release of All Eyes on Me in 1996, Tupac was everywhere, and Death Row was everywhere. Suge Knight at that point was what it looked like at his peak. I just want to slow down for a second and point something out. because this part of the story is very easy to get lost in. The platinum records, the cultural moments, the names, and all of that was real. Death Row was on top during that period. However, what also matters is the environment inside the record label. So Dr. Dre had a 50% ownership stake in Death Row, and Dre actually ended up walking away from it voluntarily with essentially nothing just to get out of that environment. That was not a business decision. That was a survival decision. And when the person who built the sound of your label makes that decision, that tells you something about what was happening inside those walls that the platinum records weren't showing. Death Row in the mid-90s looked like an empire. The music was undeniable. The artists were magnetic. The revenue was enormous. And Suge Knight had built a reputation that made the entire music industry take him seriously in a way that most executives never achieve. But the same thing that made Death Row feel untouchable was also making it unstable. The fear that kept people in line was also the thing that kept people from being honest, keeping people from pushing back when decisions were bad. Because empires built on fear don't fall from outside pressure, they collapse from the inside. September 7th, 1996, Las Vegas, Nevada. Suge Knight and Tupac Shakur are at the MGM Grand to watch Mike Tyson fight Bruce Seldon. At this point, Death Row is at the height of its power. All Eyes on Me has already dropped. Tupac is one of the most famous people on the planet, and Suge is right there with him, at ringside in Las Vegas, in what should have been a victory lap moment. After the fight in the lobby of the MGM Grand, a confrontation breaks out. Tupac, Suge, and people around him get into a physical altercation with another group of men. The whole thing is caught on surveillance cameras. Now here's why that matters beyond just the fight itself. Suge Knight was on probation at the time. A physical altercation, especially one caught on camera, was a direct violation of those terms. In one night, at what should have been a victory lap moment, he handed the legal system exactly what it needed. Later that same night, Tupac Shakur was shot multiple times in a drive-by while riding in Suge's BMW. Suge was grazed by shrapnel. Tupac was rushed to the hospital. He died 6 days later on September 13th, 1996. I'm not going to get into the theories around what happened that night. That's a whole separate conversation and not what this video is about. What I will say is that the death of Tupac Shakur changed Death Row Records in ways it never recovered from. The label's most electric artist was gone. The cloud around the label got darker, and Suge Knight, because of the MGM Grand fight, was looking at serious prison time. He was sentenced to 9 years for the probation violation, served approximately 5, was released in August of 2001. And right there, right at that moment, is where a different man might have made a different choice. But Suge didn't make a different choice. What followed over the next decade and a half was a pattern. Not one bad moment, not one unlucky situation. A pattern. And I want to walk you through it quickly. Not to pile on, but because the pattern is the point. After his release in 2001, he was back in legal trouble within a year. A probation violation for moving without notifying his parole officer and associating with known gang members. In 2003, he punched a parking lot valet outside a Hollywood nightclub and served 10 months. In 2005, he was shot in the leg at an MTV VMAs pre-party in Miami. No arrests were ever made. That same year, he was picked up on a marijuana charge. Then in 2006, something happened that didn't involve a courtroom, but might have been the most significant development of all. Death Row filed for bankruptcy. A court-appointed trustee took over due to what the judge described as gross mismanagement. The label that had generated an estimated $100 million a year was gone, auctioned off eventually. Done. The empire was done. It was over. However, the behavior continued. In 2008, Las Vegas once again, Suge was accused of being involved in an incident with a woman that led to charges including drug possession, domestic violence, and felony assault with a deadly weapon. I want to be clear, these were accusations and not charges, not convictions. But he posted bail and was reportedly arrested again the very next day on additional charges. In 2012, he was pulled over in Las Vegas with marijuana in the car, multiple outstanding warrants, and a suspended license. In 2013, he was arrested on an outstanding warrant during a traffic stop in Los Angeles. And then 2014, which deserves a little more information because of what it tells you about where things were heading. There was another situation, and this time it happened in West Hollywood. At a pre-VMAs party, Suge Knight was shot 6 times. He survived surgery, and afterward, he refused to cooperate with police investigators. It was never known who shot him. That same year, 2014, he was arrested with comedian Cat Williams for allegedly stealing a photographer's camera in Beverly Hills. Charged with robbery. I want to be precise here, charged, not convicted. That case was ultimately resolved later. But the charge alone was significant. Given his prior criminal history, that robbery charge carried the potential for up to 30 years to life under California's sentencing laws. And then in 2014, he was charged with sending threatening text messages to F. Gary Gray, the director who had been hired to make the Straight Outta Compton biopic, the movie about the era Suge helped build, the movie he wasn't even invited to be a part of. So let's zoom out for a second and look at what we're actually looking at here. By 2014, Death Row was gone. The money was largely gone. The artists had all moved on, some to massive success, some to tragedy, but all of them away from Suge. The legal system had given him suspended sentences, probation, and multiple chances to recalibrate, and again and again and again. So this pattern just kept on happening. And the world Suge had built his power inside no longer existed. But Suge was still operating like it did, still moving like a man whose reputation alone could clear a room, still reaching for the same tools: pressure, intimidation, confrontation, that had worked in 1991. But the problem was, this wasn't the 90s anymore. There were cameras everywhere, and the same kind of confrontation that once built Suge's reputation was about to become evidence against him. In early 2015, a biographical film about NWA was in production, Straight Outta Compton, a movie covering one of the most significant eras in West Coast hip-hop history. Dr. Dre and Ice Cube were both involved in the project. Suge Knight was not. He wasn't invited to participate in a film that covered an era. He had a direct hand in building, and that exclusion bothered Suge Knight. So Suge was basically angry about being left out, and on top of that, Suge was also unhappy about how he was being portrayed in the film, not as a visionary or a businessman, but as an enforcer, as someone defined by violence and intimidation. I mean, that's really who he was at the end of the day, so I don't know why you would be mad at that. And we already know that months before any of this came to a head, Suge had been charged with sending threatening communications to F. Gary Gray, the director of that film. That charge was already pending before January 29th even arrived. On January 29th, 2015, Suge Knight drove to a location connected to the Straight Outta Compton production. He asked to meet with Dr. Dre and Ice Cube. He was turned away, and at that location, he got into a verbal confrontation with a man named Cleabone Sloan. Cleabone Sloan was a Compton native and a former gang member who had transitioned into film work. He was serving as a consultant and advisor on the Straight Outta Compton production, someone who understood the world the film was depicting because he had lived inside it. After that initial confrontation, Suge drove to Tam's Burgers, a burger stand in Compton, not far from the production, and that's where things became irreversible. And at this particular location, there was going to be a victim. His name is Terry Carter. Now, before we get into what actually happened, really quickly, I just want to talk about Terry Carter before we go any further, because he deserves more than just being a name in this story. Terry was a 55-year-old businessman, a Compton figure who founded and ran a record label called Heavyweight Records with rapper Ice Cube, closely connected to the label from the very beginning. Terry also had a huge passion for lowrider cars. It was actually pretty known around the nation through this. Now, Terry wasn't just some random person in Suge's orbit. Him and Suge had known each other for years, and actually Suge looked at Terry as a friend, and the two came up together as young men in Compton before rising through the music industry in different ways. Suge through Death Row and Carter through Heavyweight Records with Ice Cube. Terry Carter had also reportedly been trying to help repair the relationship between Suge Knight and Dr. Dre. That's why his presence at Tam's Burgers matters. So this was a man who by all means was there to bring peace to the situation. And the story is that he was there as a mediator, someone who basically, created peace and made sure that every person who was there to communicate did so effectively. So he wasn't there as a rival, he wasn't there as an enemy, he was someone who knew the people involved and wanted everyone to get along. And it was confirmed that Terry Carter was not a part of what was about to happen. He was there to help. Now this is what happened. According to police accounts and witness statements, deputies responded to the 1200 block of West Rosecrans Avenue in Compton for what was reported as a possible hand-run traffic accident. When they got there, they found Terry Carter lying in the street. Cleabone Sloan was lying in the parking lot. According to witnesses, Suge Knight had driven up to the location in a pickup truck. While he was still seated inside the truck, he got into an argument with Sloan, who was standing near the driver's side door. That argument escalated, and then, according to the police account, Suge drove the truck in reverse, striking Sloan and knocking him to the ground. Then he drove forward through the parking lot at a high rate of speed, running over Sloan a second time, and also running over Terry Carter. After that, Suge drove away from the scene. Terry Carter suffered multiple blunt force trauma injuries. He was taken to the hospital where he was pronounced dead. Cleabone Sloan suffered blunt force injuries as well. He was also taken to the hospital, treated, and he survived. One of the 911 callers who saw what happened described the same basic sequence in real time. She told the dispatchers that the men were fighting, and then the truck pulled back, pulled forward, and ran them over. She said the two men were lying on the ground. And as the truck left the scene, She said she and her passenger tried to follow it and get a picture of the license plate, but before they could do that, the truck was quick enough to leave the scene. That's how fast this went from an argument in a parking lot to a fatal hit-and-run investigation.
Fire department. This car ran over two guys that were fighting, and then he just pulled back and pushed forward and run them over. Two guys are laying down. 142nd, man. What city are you in? Compton, I think. I just passed by.
The deadly hit-and-run was eventually connected to Suge Knight. After leaving the scene, Suge abandoned his vehicle in a parking lot in Westwood, about 20 miles north of Compton. The red 2-ton Ford F-150 Raptor truck was later found by police, and Suge Knight eventually turned himself in to the authorities at approximately 3 in the morning the following day. He was charged with murder, attempted first-degree murder, and 2 counts of hit-and-run. Now let's talk about this part because there are 2 different versions of the events that were told. So let's talk about each of those first. Prosecutors argued that Suge Knight intentionally used his truck as a deadly weapon, that this was not an accident and it was not self-defense. They stated. Suge's defense argued the opposite. His attorney said he had been attacked by multiple men, that he feared for his life, and that he drove forward trying to flee a dangerous situation. He was not trying to hurt anyone. Now, I'm not going to tell you which version is true or not, because the truth is, a jury never decided. Suge actually never went to trial. What I can tell you is that the defense had some serious issues working against them. 2 of Suge's former attorneys were later indicted for allegedly attempting to bribe potential witnesses, and were reportedly trying to manufacture testimony, suggesting that there were guns at the scene in order to support the self-defense argument. That's of course not a detail that helps the self-defense credibility. And the surveillance footage, which was a part of the evidence and reviewed in court, showed what it showed. The most painful part about this case is Terry Carter. Whatever happened in that parking lot, whatever, or however you want to interpret the confrontation, whatever you believe about the intent, Terry Carter was not Suge's enemy. He wasn't there to fight. He literally came over. He went there to smooth the situation over. He was a peacemaker who walked into the wrong moment. His widow, Lillian, later wrote a letter that was read in court. She said when you search her husband's name, you don't find anything about who he really was, his role in the community, what he meant to his family, what kind of man he was. What you find is the footage of the moment he died. He was so much more than the guy the defendant killed with his truck, she wrote. He was my husband, my best friend, my provider. Suge pleaded not guilty to all the original charges and spent the next 3 years in county jail awaiting trial. The case moved slowly, delays, legal motions, attorney changes. By some counts, Suge apparently went through more than a dozen lawyers over the course of the case. And then just days before the jury selection was scheduled to begin, everything changed. On September 20th, 2018, nearly 4 years after the incident at Tam's Burgers, Suge Knight walked into the Los Angeles courtroom and entered a plea. Not guilty, not innocent, no contest. If you're not familiar with what no contest means, here's the simple version. It's not the same as saying you did it, but it's also not a denial. What it means legally is that you're accepting the punishment without formally admitting guilt. In practical terms, for sentencing purposes, it functions the same as a guilty plea. The case is over, you're done fighting, and Suge Knight was done fighting. By that point, this case had already produced some surreal courtroom moments. At one of his early hearings in 2015, his bail was set at $25 million. Around that same period, Suge collapsed in court and had to receive medical attention. That moment became one of the first visuals people saw from this case. Not the untouchable death row boss from the 90s, not the man people whispered about in the industry, but an older Suge Knight in the courtroom, facing a murder case with a bail number so high, it made it clear how serious this had become. And by 2018, the situation was even heavier. Now here's something important to understand about why he took that plea deal. So this plea didn't just resolve the Terry Carter case. It resolved 3 separate criminal cases at once. The hit-and-run manslaughter case, the Cat Williams camera robbery case from 2014, and the threatening communications case involving F. Gary Gray. From 3 cases, 1 agreement. Prosecutors made it clear if Suge went to trial and was convicted on all original charges across those 3 cases, he was potentially looking at up to 100 years to life in prison. So Suge Knight, of course, took 28 years as a plea deal to avoid a number he'd never come back from. But also, let's talk about why it was 28 years. Because that number doesn't just come from nowhere. And the way it breaks down tells you everything about what this whole story has actually been about. The charge he pleaded guilty to, voluntary manslaughter, carried a base sentence of 11 years in California. That was a starting point. But Suge didn't have a clean record. He had decades of criminal history, including prior felony convictions. And in California, there is a law called the 3 Strikes Law. The basic idea is this: if you have prior serious or violent felony convictions on your record, the courts can double your sentence when you're convicted of a new one. Suge had those prior convictions, so the 11 years got doubled, that's 22. Then there was a 5-year enhancement for a prior serious or violent felony, and because the truck was treated as a deadly weapon in his case, 1 more year was added on top of that. 11 plus 11 plus 5 plus 1. 28 years. Suge Knight's criminal record, which was built during the death row era, became part of the math that doubled his sentence. Decades later, the same chapter of his life that made him powerful is the chapter that made the punishment worse. On October 4th, 2018, Suge Knight was sentenced to 28 years in state prison. The daughter of Terry Carter described Suge Knight as a truly disgusting, selfish disgrace to the human species. The most feared man in hip-hop, the man who had once controlled one of the most powerful labels in music, who had made executives nervous and artists careful, who had operated for decades like the rules didn't fully apply to him, was taken away in an orange jumpsuit. He was sent to Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego. At the time of me making this video, Suge Knight is still in prison. His earliest possible parole eligibility, based on public available records, is October 2034. He'll be 69 years old. And that's not a guarantee. That's just the earliest the door opens for a conversation about it. I guess, what do you even make of a story like this? Well, when you build everything on fear, your business, your reputation, your relationships, your survival, you're building on something that requires constant maintenance, constant escalation, constant proof. And at some point, the proof you give the world becomes the evidence used against you. Suge Knight didn't just lose because the game changed. He lost because he never did. And that's how hip-hop's Boogeyman eventually, one day, lost control. If you made it this far, drop a like on this video, subscribe if you're new here. My name is Blackie Speaks. Nice to meet you. Let me know what you think about this topic in the comment section below, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace, I'm out.